Hi everyone, and welcome to part two of the Aristotle recordings for the Nicomachean Ethics. So this is the sort of middle part of book one that we're looking at. So here Aristotle's already determined that, well, he's already outlined the idea of the master versus the subordinate goods and the master versus the subordinate arts, and um, the basic idea is that the master of anything should be preferred over the subordinate. So the master good should be preferred over or is superior to all of the subordinate goods that we get. Um, if you remember, he sort of talked about the idea that the master good for society is politics, because this is the business of making a community of people better. When we're talking about the individual, the master good that we're going to be looking at is to try and achieve happiness. And that's what Aristotle's going to be talking about here. We'll have a look at a few different or a few alternative views of what the absolute good is. But Aristotle's going to dismiss these pretty quickly. So we're looking at book one, chapters 4 and 5 in this section. So readers out, highlighters at the ready, and here we go. So we're going from book one, chapter 4. So what is the human good? Um, all right, so it is generally agreed to be happiness, but there are various views as to what happiness is. What is required at the start is an unreasoned conviction about the facts, such as is produced by a good upbringing. So in this chapter, we're going to see Aristotle talk about a few different perspectives on what happiness might be, as this is the chief good that we're trying to achieve. Um, he's going to talk about a few alternative views and dismiss them relatively quickly. And he's going to explain to us the type of people that we should be listening to and gaining advice from about this. Okay, so here we go. Chapter 4. Let us resume our inquiry and state, in view of the fact that all knowledge and every pursuit aims at some good, what it is that we say political science aims at, and what is the highest of all goods achievable by action. Verbally, there is a very general agreement, for both the general run of men and people of superior refinement say that it is happiness, and identify living well and faring well with being happy. But with regard to what happiness is, they differ, and the many do not give the same account as the wise. So here we've had Aristotle talk about a few different groups of people. When he says the general run of men and people of superior refinement, he's essentially saying sort of the uneducated and then the well-educated. Remember, Greece had a pretty significant class system. And so when he's saying the people of superior refinement, he's talking about the upper class. When he's talking about the general run of men, these were sort of the laborers, the slaves, that sort of person. Um, and later in that little part that we read, he talked about a great little line: the many do not give the same account as the wise. So Aristotle here is saying, okay, well, we can all agree that it's happiness, but what does happiness actually entail? If I ask the majority of people, they'll give me one answer, but if I ask the wise, they'll give me a different one. So this is one of those perfect examples where democracy really wouldn't work all that well, because the many would not have the correct idea according to Aristotle. We should be listening to the experts instead, the wise. So let's continue on. For the former, this is the many, think it is some plain and obvious thing like pleasure, wealth, or honor. They differ, however, from one another, and often even the same man identifies it with different things: with health when he is ill, with wealth when he is poor. But, conscious of their ignorance, they admire those who proclaim some great thing that is above their comprehension. So here Aristotle's talked about the idea that sort of the general person in the street, they're going to see happiness as whatever their life is lacking at that point. So if, as Aristotle said, if they're sick, then they're going to see happiness as being healthy. If they're poor, they're going to see happiness as being wealthy. That sort of idea. Now, obviously Aristotle was writing, the better part of 2,500 years ago, but I think this is still very true today. When you talk to people about, well, what would make you happy? Quite often it's the thing that they're missing. Oh, if I just had a little bit more time, if I wasn't so busy all the time, and then, oh, if I could just get a little bit more money and be more financially secure, then I'd be happy. Or if, I could just be a little bit fitter, or if I could just eat a little bit healthier, or whatever. Okay, so we're still very much, the majority of people at least, are still very much in that mindset that happiness is possessed by whatever they're missing. So they're not happy right now because they're not healthy. They're not happy right now because they're not rich enough. And if they could just get healthier, or if they could just be a bit richer, then they'd be happy. Um, so even though this was written a long time ago, I think it's still very true of the way that we talk about happiness today. Um, now, some thought that apart from these many goods, there is another which is good in itself, and causes the goodness of all these as well. To examine all the options that have been held were perhaps somewhat fruitless. Enough to examine those that are most prevalent, or that seem to be arguable. Um, Yeah, sorry, I just lost my point when I was turning the page there, or seem to be arguable. Let us not fail to notice, however, that there is a difference between arguments from and those to the first principles. For Plato too was right in raising the question and asking, as he used to do, are we on the way from or to the first principles? There is a difference, as there is in a race course between the course from the judges to the turning point and the way back. For while we must begin with what is evident, things are evident in two ways, some to us, some without qualification. So this, like, it's a confusing little section, and yeah, there's a lot of background about this idea of first principles and that sort of thing that we don't need to have a full understanding of to understand Aristotle's point here. But to give a little bit of it, first principle is, sometimes we refer to it as like a maxim in philosophy, or the easiest way to think about it is something that is true without any requirement of further evidence. So, you know, mathematics is generally filled with first principle ideas. Okay, so a triangle is a side of only three shapes. Sorry, a shape rather of only three sides. Okay. Uh, if you ask me why, I don't need to provide any more justification than simply saying that is what a triangle is. So it might seem like circular reasoning, and to a certain degree that it is, but it's one of those cases where just because it's circular reasoning doesn't make it wrong. A triangle, by definition, is a shape of only three sides. Um, and I don't need to justify that anymore. I don't need to provide any more evidence than that. That is what it is. Okay. And so what we're talking about here is Aristotle is kind of asking, okay, well, are we looking for something that is uh, obvious to us without any further justification, like a first principle? Or are we working from a first principle and trying to build on that, like using a first principle as a foundation? That's kind of what he's talking about here. Okay. That was a little bit confusing. Don't worry too much. Like I said, we don't really need to have a complete understanding of first principles to understand what Aristotle is getting at here. Um, uh, because as he's going to say in the next line, well, presumably then we must begin with things that with things evident to us. So he's going to shift looking at, well, is this something that's purely rational, like mathematics? It doesn't exist out in the world around us. It's purely an idea. And he's quickly going to go to, no, well, let's deal with the world around us. Remember, Aristotle is very much a person who likes to deal in practical arguments, things that can actually be applied to our life. Okay, so he's going to shift our attention back to, no, well, let's look at what is around us, okay, and what we can actually view and measure. All right. So, continuing on. Hence, anyone who is to listen intelligently to lectures about what is noble and just, and generally about the subjects of political science, must have been brought up in good habits. For the fact is a starting point, and if this is sufficiently plain to him, he will not need the reason as well. Um, so, basically, in that little section there, Aristotle has said, if for you to be able to actually consider this properly, like what a good life is and what happiness entails, you need to have had a good upbringing and you need to have good habits. Um, if you have those things, you don't need any more justification. And if you don't have those things, no amount of justification will actually help you. And so remember who Aristotle's writing this book for. This is for the upper class young men of Greece to learn how to become the rulers of the world, really, but to be good people in doing it, to save them from corruption. So he's basically saying not everyone is fit for this discussion. If you are, then we can progress with the discussion, and you don't actually need any further reasoning. Um, if you're not, then no amount of reasoning would be able to persuade you anyway, because you've been brought up with poor habits anyway. So it doesn't really matter. Um, he will. Sorry. So for a starting point, for the facts is a starting point, and if this is sufficiently plain to him, he will not need the reason as well. And the man who has been well brought up has or can easily get starting points. As for him who neither has nor can get them, let him hear the words of Hesiod. Far best is he who knows all things himself. Good he that hearkens when men counsel right, but he who neither knows nor lays to heart another's wisdom is a useless wight. So that little poem there from the writer Hesiod, this is, it's saying if you know everything, awesome. That would be ideal. If you don't know everything, a good person is the type of person who listens to people who are more educated than them on subjects. The worst type of person is someone who doesn't know anything but doesn't listen to advice. Okay, and so he's sort of saying what type of people we need to be dealing with here, who we should be listening to, and who this stuff, who he's writing for, really. It is not for everyone. Not everyone is suited to this type of discussion. All right, that's chapter 4. Let's move on to chapter 5. So we get a little bit more into some perspectives on what happiness is here. We'll look at the idea of pleasure, honor, and wealth, and see why Aristotle finds all of these things as lacking. Okay, so here we go. Discussion of the popular views that the good is pleasure, honor, wealth. A fourth kind of life, that of contemplation, is deferred for further discussion. The contemplative life is essentially the life of philosophy, thinking about things and really, contemplating them and trying to come to the correct decision around things. Let us, however, resume our discussion from the point at which we digressed. To judge from the lives that men lead, most men, and men of the most vulgar type, seem, not without some ground, to identify the good or happiness with pleasure, which is the reason why they love the life of enjoyment. So this is the first common view of what the good life is, what happiness is. It is being in a state of pleasure. Okay, and so this is why the vast majority of people seek a life of enjoyment. They just want to enjoy basic things, like this is like watching TV. Okay, it's not making you a better person. This is not difficult for you. You're very inactive when you're doing it. You turn on the TV and the light sort of hypnotizes you, and you just sit there and lose time, and you laugh when the TV tells you to laugh, and you cry when the TV tells you to cry, and it's just very passive. You're not actually doing anything to make yourself a better person, really. And so this is the basic life of enjoyment. give me all the snacks that I can have, sit me in front of the TV with an infinite number of channels that I can flick through, and, I'll sit on my couch until I die. That kind of idea. Okay. Uh, but this is the most vulgar type of person, according to Aristotle. For there are, we may say, three prominent types of life. That just mentioned, so the life of pleasure, the political, and thirdly, the contemplative life. Now, the mass of mankind are evidently quite slavish in their tastes, preferring a life suitable to beasts, but they get some ground for their view from the fact that many of those in high places share the tastes of Sardanapalus. Um, so I have no idea who Sardanapalus is. You can Google it, I'm sure. I'm not going to pretend to know. But more important is what Aristotle's talking about here, which is the vast majority of people are very slavish in their view of what happiness is. And they think happiness is just that basic idea of pleasure. If I've got a smile on my face, then I must be happy. Okay, if I'm doing something I enjoy, then I must be happy. Um, the issue with this is, as I said before, generally we're quite passive when we're doing that. Okay, it's not building us as people. Okay, uh, Aristotle's forgiving of the general populace, and he says it's not really their fault because the vast majority of society is set up around this idea that we should be chasing pleasures. And when you think about advertisements and well, the way our entire society is set up, we've been reinforced with this idea that we need to do the things that we enjoy. Just follow your your pleasures, and it will lead you to a pleasurable life. Well, yes and no. It might lead you to a really bad life too. You know, drug addicts follow their pleasures, and we wouldn't identify them as having a good life. But it is the view that society has sort of pushed on us. So moving on now to the next type of life, which is honor. A consideration of the prominent types of life shows that people of superior refinement and of active disposition identify happiness with honor. For this is, roughly speaking, the end of the political life. So if the general person in the street is someone who pursues pleasure, then the upper class are pursuing what Aristotle is calling honor. So they want to be looked at well, essentially. And this, he says, is the end of political life. So in ancient Greece, if you were someone of any consequence in society, it meant you were involved in politics. And this meant that you were probably being honored in your life. Okay. But it seems too superficial to be what we are looking for, since it is thought to depend on those who bestow honour rather than on him who receives it. But the good we divine to be something of one's own, and not easily taken from one. Further, men seem to pursue honour in order that they may be assured of their merit. At least it is by men of practical wisdom that they seek to be honoured, and among those who know them, and on the ground of their virtue. Clearly, then, according to them at any rate, virtue is better. So Aristotle sort of said two things in this section. Firstly, it's really dangerous to say that honor is the same as happiness, because honor is given to us by other people and it can just as easily be taken away. We don't want happiness to be something that's dished out by someone else and can very easily be taken away by someone else. We should be able to be happy with no one else, or in the face of people who are trying to take that happiness away. So if it's something that can be so easily taken away, perhaps honor isn't what we're talking about here. And then he talks about the idea of, well, a good person wants to be honored for the type of person that they are, for their character. And Aristotle says because they want to be seen as being a virtuous person, having a virtuous character. Well, this would mean that virtue then is more important than honor. Because if honor is dependent on virtue, on being virtuous, or at least being seen to be virtuous, then virtue is more important than honor. Okay, so there's a few issues with honor here. And perhaps one might even suppose this to be, rather than honor, the end of the political life. But even this appears somewhat incomplete, for possession of virtue seems actually compatible with being asleep, or with lifelong inactivity, and further with the greatest sufferings and misfortunes. But a man who was living so no one would call happy, unless he were maintaining a thesis at all costs. But enough of this, for the subject has been sufficiently treated in every popular discussion. Third comes the contemplative life, which we shall consider later. So, uh, is happiness the same as being virtuous? No, not really. Aristotle is saying because uh, this, could be compatible with being asleep. Well, I'm not doing anything wrong when I'm sleeping. Am I happy? Well, I mean, I am pretty happy when I get a good night's sleep, which is rare. But um, is this the same thing? It doesn't fit. It doesn't feel like that's correct. I could be being virtuous and be suffering greatly, and no one would really call me happy then. So it doesn't feel like virtue and happiness are actually the same thing. Uh, the contemplative life, as he says he's going to talk about later, the life of money making is one undertaken under compulsion, and wealth is evidently not the good we are seeking, for it is merely useful and for the sake of something else. And so one might rather take the aforenamed objects to be ends, for they are loved for themselves. But it is evident that not even these are the end. Yet many arguments have been wasted on the support of them. Let us leave this subject then. So Aristotle's quite dismissive of the idea of wealth being the source of happiness because, as he points out, the only reason you want money is so that you can buy things. This means that money itself is meaningless. Why do this might then lead you to say, but isn't the thing that I buy then the source of my happiness? Well, no, not really. Because much like, for example, honor, that thing can be taken away very easily. I'm sure we've all had the frustration when our phone stops working the way that it did or whatever. Something breaks, blah, blah, blah. This can't be real happiness. And those things are usually very fleeting. We buy something and we're very happy with it for a period of time, and then the novelty wears off, and we're like, we're always looking for something new. So this doesn't feel like true happiness. There's nothing sustained about it. Okay, so we've seen Aristotle here eliminate quite a few options. Hopefully, it's been clear enough for you. If you've got any questions, let me know in class. I hope you enjoy the rest of the recordings for Aristotle. Like and subscribe. Bye.